All right, so we need to finish talking about chapter 7 today. Here's the roll sheet and move into chapter 8. I apologize if I go a little quickly through this. We are considerably behind where the online class is, and it's creating angst for them because I give them access, obviously. Well, the whole world has access to my videos because they're on YouTube and they're not set to private. So that's one of the reasons I tell you that if you're in the witness protection program, this is not going to turn out well for you because you will be on film. You've already been there, so I apologize if the mob comes and kneecaps you or something like that because I didn't know. But I did say that at the beginning of class. But I also put it on their D2L site, so they're anxious about when I'm going to get caught up. So I'm going to try and move quickly and get caught up, and I apologize in advance for that we've gotten a little bit behind, but that's sort of life. That's one of the fun things I think about taking a face-to-face class is that you can tailor it, and one of the things that I can do in engaging in my own sort of little integrated marketing communication from a sales perspective is I can see what's interesting to you because I can monitor the feedback in real time and see whether or not you're participating, if you're active, if you're talking. But I'm going to try and get caught up. So we stopped with talking about Dagmar and the characteristics of a good objective, and just as a sort of a recap of where we were. It should be concrete and measurable. There should be a temporal aspect to it, which is the fourth characteristic. Have a specific target audience in mind, and then benchmark or measures that make it objective. There are some criticisms of this approach, and one of the criticisms is that there's a response with the hierarchy. And critics note that consumers are not necessarily linear thinkers. We tend to believe that we are, but we aren't. And one of the analogies that I use here is a Russian linguist named Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin says that we demand that our stories be monoglossia, which means that they follow a linear narrative. So if you think about a story, how does a story progress? When you read a novel, what is it that happens? How many of you like novels? I'm not a big novel reader, but how many of you read novels? Nobody?
Oh, you read novels?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many of you read? Anybody else read novels?
Not recently.
Not recently.
Yeah.
How does a novel progress?
It depends on the genre. Are you talking about like crime or fiction? Or...
Well, novels are generally fiction. They're not.
I mean, like
they're
sorry.
non-fiction. They're not
Like
called novels. They're called biographies or history, I
Yeah,
suppose.
like well, there's historical fiction and there's new modern styles of writing. It's like crime novels. There's different perspectives, but usually it's.
So usually it's in a linear fashion. You're introduced to the characters in the beginning, and if it's a crime novel, there will be something that happens, a crime that takes place. If you think about Murder on the Orient Express, and then there are, there's a sort of a build-up of various ideas. There are red herrings that are kind of introduced, but it progresses from the start of you got the detective in a crime novel, and then you got a murder usually that takes place, or if it's a heist novel like Ocean's 11 or Ocean's 8, that occurs, and then sort of a climax, and then an ending or a conclusion. And it's a very nice linear way of thinking. We don't often think about that, and that's one of the criticisms of Dagmar, is that we don't really think that way in many instances. Life is not necessarily linear. And Mikhail Bakhtin says we actually talk in heteroglossia. So if you think about conversations that you have with your friends, let's suppose that you have an insignificant other that you go home to every day, and with this person you have a child. Did you pick up Johnny from daycare today? You respond, I had to go get my hair cut. Well, that's not responsive, right, to the actual question, but your spouse or your insignificant other is going to understand that, like, you went and got your hair cut before and you're going to go back, or what. I mean, there's a way that we talk that's not necessarily linear, and it's heteroglot. There's an example of this in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Jacques the Fatalist. It's not a novel, it's sort of an anti-novel. And it just is sort of this series of odd vignettes. It follows Jacques and his master. The full title of the book is Jacques the Fatalist and His Master, and their exploits. And at one point in it, it's just these sort of jumbled up series. They actually turn on the reader. And the author says, you thought I was going to tell you about Jacques' loves. Well, I'm not. I have no idea what happened and how many loves Jacques has had. You've been raised on love stories. All you want, reader, is love stories. 1, 2, 3, 4 love stories you've heard so far, and 5 more you'll hear before the end. And then it just completely goes off in another direction. And that's actually the way sort of life progresses. We don't actually think, we don't move in necessarily linear motions. A lot of life is actually maybe cyclical in nature. We follow sort of seasons. And so we don't necessarily, as consumers, go through this process. If you think about the rational actor model of making decisions where we are exposed to something, there's something called the 3 exposure hypothesis, which says that basically we have to be exposed to something 3 times before we get it. We're exposed to it, we gain information, we do a search, we evaluate alternatives, we then buy, and then make a post-purchase evaluation and behavior, whether or not we're going to rebuy. That's really not maybe what we do, is it? A lot of it is we just sort of react. And so consumers are not necessarily linear in their thinking about things. Some people argue that sales objectives and sales are the only relevant measure for advertising. There's a criticism that it's not practical and the costs of implementing the system are overly inhibitive, and that it inhibits creativity, actually. Creative personnel often feel that it focuses too much on quantitative assessments rather than sort of the creative approach, and it stifles that creativity. And so there is this tension, and we'll talk about that in chapter 8, this tension of, sort of the creative with this quantitative analysis. Problems with setting objectives. Many advertisers fail to set appropriate objectives. They have an unrealistic expectation, or maybe they don't have many expectations at all. And your text tells you that top management often only has abstract ideas of what integrated marketing communication should do. And I think with regard to small to mid-sized businesses, they don't really have an idea of what integrated marketing communication is. Consumers will do this for you if you don't do it. They will come up with, in their mind, an image of what your business is, and it may not be the image that you want to portray. And so I suggest that you should engage in it, but if you only have sort of this abstract idea of what it is that you want to accomplish through advertising and promotion and communication with your constituents, that can be problematic. And particularly at top corporate levels, if you're talking about big businesses, the parent company may be disengaged from the strategic business units. That's what happened with, for example, what was the car company that GM had that went out of business?
Pontiac?
Not Pontiac, it's gone blank all of a sudden.
Oh.
No, well, Hummer went out of business as well. That may have, it'll come to me in a minute. It was the one that had the totally new buying model. It was supposed to be no pressure buying into dealerships. Anybody remember?
What year did they?
It went out in like 2005. Anyway,
Motley?
no. That strategic business unit was not supported by top management GM because, and it was actually
Oh,
a
Saturn.
Saturn. That's it. Saturn is the car company that I'm thinking of. It was actually a sale on both ends. The labor unions hated it because it was not unionized, and all the rest of the GM shops were unionized. Saturn wasn't. The dealers hated it because it had a different pricing and negotiation model, and the company itself didn't do much to support the brand, and so they had really no idea, maybe just an abstract concept of what IMC should do with regard to Saturn, and it never really translated well into a holistic approach to marketing that product. The ad industry, your text tells you, often has a poor quality assurance system. There's been very little to try and come up with effective measures of quality assurance. How do we do that? And a lot of creative types, again, will argue that it's almost impossible to do. And that what's a really catchy and great ad is often very difficult to predict. Now, that being said, in an age in which we have access to so much information and so much data, businesses are demanding more and more accountability in terms of their marketing and their resources, their integrated marketing communications programs. So, setting IMC objectives, Schultz argues for an outside-in approach to planning. Generally speaking, how companies have gone about this, and if you think about back to that marketing philosophy, what has been the dominant philosophy of businesses for most of human history? Well, it's been the production philosophy. If you build it, they will come. And again, lots of companies still operate with this philosophy. Apple under Steve Jobs was notorious for not caring what the consumer wanted. We're going to tell you what's cool and you will buy it. Microsoft is famous. I mean, it's a big company, no longer the most valuable company in the world. It's been surpassed by what? Who's now the richest man in the world? Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
But Microsoft's Bill Gates for many, many years was the wealthiest man in the world. And Microsoft is really a crappy product. There was a better product at one point in time out there. There was a better operating system. What was it called? Linux. It was actually easier to use. Why did Linux not take off and Microsoft did? Linux was not proprietary. Nobody really knew who owned it. Microsoft was proprietary. That means that you can marshal resources, you can collect, funds to promote it. But historically, we've started with, we're going to develop a product and then we're going to put it out there. And then you go from an inside out way of thinking about it. Schultz says you ought to start with the customer and then build backward to the brand. Tom Duncan advocates a zero-based communications strategy. What's zero-based? This is a takeoff on, how many of you have heard of something in accounting and finance called zero-based budgeting? Anybody heard of that concept? It became very popular among particularly municipalities and governmental entities to say we're going to do a zero-based budget, which means what? Every single budget year, everybody starts with zero and you have to justify your budget. Most people that tried it, most entities that tried it, when I was vice mayor in Guthrie, I advocated for a zero-based budget. And it didn't work because they could never figure out how to quite do it. It was very difficult to implement. But Duncan says you start with zero-based communication planning. You start with the task and then determine what are the best ideas and the media needed to accomplish that task. Which leads us to budgeting theory. And this is my least favorite topic because I'm a theory guy, but budgeting theory is not really like grand level theories that we think about in terms of philosophy. So what are the theoretical foundations of budgeting? Well, marginal analysis. The idea is that IMC expenditures equal growth to a certain point and then level off, and every dollar spent over that, you're not really getting much bang for your buck. And so what should you do? You should advertise to the point at which you get the maximum amount and then, figure out that point and stop. Profits are a result of your gross margin minus the IMC expenses. There are problems, of course, with marginal analysis. All budgeting theory models have problems, just like all ethical theory models have problems. One is that there's an assumption that sales are a direct measure of your IMC. And as we've seen, that can be difficult to predict. You might put an ad out there, see a sales increase, and there may be other factors that are leading to the increase in sales. So for example, if Coca-Cola runs a really good advertising campaign this Christmas, they may see a spike in Coca-Cola sales, but what else might be driving the fact that Coca-Cola sales will be up at Christmas time? Well, it could be that it's Christmas time and people have this sort of nostalgia for certain types of things that they drink with their family at Christmas, and Coke is a part of that. What else could be driving it? Well, the economy is pretty good, so people are spending more, so they may be buying more on it.
People usually have more gatherings and get-togethers. So
Yeah, there's more parties at Christmas than there are lots of organizations. UCO among them has a Christmas party where the president hosts it over in the University Center, and they have, they provide beverages and non-alcoholic stuff, which is one of the reasons that it doesn't last very long. People leave very, very quickly.
You should try going to the ones at his house.
Have you been to the ones at his house?
I'm in PLC, so yeah. Yeah, it was.
Assumption that sales are determined solely by IMC and ignores things like price, the product, place factors, other marketing conditions. So there's sales response model, relationship between integrated marketing, communication, and sales. There's an idea that there's a concave or downward functioning model that posits that effects of advertising quickly diminish. So you have this need to advertise to get people aware, and then fewer dollars may actually be needed to create the optimal influence on the sales. And the text has a nice sort of diagram on that. There's another model called the S-shaped response curve, which says that initial outlays have little effect. And again, if you think about the 3 exposure hypothesis, which says people have to be exposed to something 3 times before they really get it, your initial, when you launch a product and you start with your advertising campaign for that product, it may have little effect. Consumers have a lot of noise that they're distracted by, but at some point it has an effect, and then you start to see more outlays result in better sales, and then start to level off at a point somewhere along that S curve. So you can have a top-down, there are different budgeting approaches. Top-down, basically, the budget is set by the executive level, the C-suite, and then it's passed down to strategic business units or to other parts of the firm. There are variations of the top-down, the affordable model, the affordability method, where you determine how much you're going to have for production and operation, and then marketing gets whatever's left over. That's used by a lot of companies, particularly those that are in survival mode. Small to mid-sized firms will use the affordable method. What can we afford? We have to produce product, right? If you think about going back to my example of, I used to go around the room and students would tell me 10 years ago, and I'd say, why'd you take this class? Well, I want to be an entrepreneur and I want to learn how to market myself. What do you want to do? I want to own a cupcake shop. And I would sort of say, that's interesting. Have you thought about how many cupcake shops there are? There's a lot. And how many do we have now? How many are still in business? There are a lot of them that have gone out of business. But you got to pay rent. You got to buy equipment. You have to spend a certain amount of money on creating the most moist and delicious and beautiful cupcake on the planet. And whatever's left over, then you can use for marketing. There's the arbitrary, again, lots of small businesses use this one, small and mid-sized business, the arbitrary allocation method. There's virtually no theoretical basis whatsoever considered in allocating dollars to your marketing plan or your advertising and promotion plan. One that's commonly used as a percentage of sales. You get a percent of the product sales are allocated to IMC. In oligopoly type situations, you'll oftentimes see a competitive parity. Think about the airlines. How many airlines are there out there anymore?
Not a lot.
They're not a lot. We don't have a whole lot of competition in the airline industry. There are some regional carriers that then lease their stuff to larger carriers like American Eagle and the sort of regional jets that are actually operated by somebody else. But there's not a whole lot of competition. And a lot of the airlines have gone broke and consolidated. Some of the big names in the airline industry have gone the way of the dodo. Pan American, for example, which was sort of the heyday of flight and the expense when it was actually, I remember the first time I went and got on an airplane, it was actually kind of a treat. It was not something that everybody did. And people actually dressed up to go get on an airplane. And they actually served you, even in non-first class, even in coach, they served you real food. Now they give you some peanuts in first class.
They can't even do
You
peanuts
can
anymore.
get.
They can't do peanuts anymore because peanut allergies.
Southwest still does peanuts.
Yeah, so
I
yeah,
took a Southwest flight 2 weeks ago. They were on pretzels and
like grapes.
and wheat thins.
Okay, well, they mix it up. I was on a flight about a month ago, and they did actually have peanuts on that Southwest flight. But so in this situation where you have Southwest and you have Delta and you have United and American, and that's basically the big players in that, they know what each other are doing in terms of their advertising. You know what the market is, and they tend to match each other's advertising expenditures, right? Because they don't want to lose market share. Another top-down approach is to focus on return on investment. You can use build-up approaches where you look at the object and the task, you define the communication objective, determine specific tasks that are needed, and then estimate the costs. Payout planning is another version where you project revenues as well as costs over a 2 or 3 year period. And then your text tells you that some people use quantitative modeling, and they tell you that this has had limited success. There has not been a lot, unlike logistics, where there have been a lot of quantitative models that have been developed for just-in-time inventory, for example. Quantitative modeling has been less used in IMC and advertising and communication. Having said that, do you think it will increase in the future? As companies have the ability to do more analysis and crunch more data, and data analytics become a bigger part, and more schools start offering courses in marketing analytics, I think you might see more use. I mean, it's very easy now to do sort of, even among small businesses, to do, for example, in my business, I've done, sort of linear regression model analysis of our expenditures and where they're coming from. So you might see more of it in the future. Planning, creative strategy planning. So this is the part of marketing that a lot of people think of as being marketing. And in my principles class, I often ask, is marketing an art or a science? And then we have a little debate. And of course, the answer is what? It's both. But if you ask the average person on the street who hasn't thought much about it and doesn't have had a business class, whether or not marketing is an art or science, they're probably going to say it's an art. And it involves, what do they think of as being marketing, generally speaking? Well, they think about advertising as being marketing. That's what most people, when you say marketing, most people think about what? They think about advertising. And so creative advertising, so this is really the art part of marketing in many respects. However, many award-winning ads have failed to produce results. The example I gave you and shared with you was the herding cats commercial. It's a really creative ad. It was well executed. It tells a story. It's like a little mini movie. It's a little vignette, but did it really result in a lot of sales for EDS? Well, no. Some businesses particularly have criticized the creative types and creative developers and claim that they're more concerned with creativity and winning awards than in actually developing effective ads. And some of the best award-winning ads, again, have not necessarily led to good results. And so there's been this criticism, particularly among businesses that employ ad agencies, that they're really more concerned with the awards than the effect that the ad has. Having said that, obviously creativity is important in advertising. We all have our favorite ads. If I ask you what are your favorite ads, what are some of the ones that you would come up with as being your favorite? Obviously for me, it's the herding cats, one of my favorite ads. of all time.
A lot of the Budweiser ones you see around the Super Bowl, those are
The
always.
Budweiser.
The horse ones that make you want to cry.
Yeah, the horse ones are really great. They fired their ad agency, by the way.
Really?
And that's why they haven't they did a whole series of the horse ads. There were 3 years in a row where they started with the horse and the puppy ad. Well, the first one didn't have the puppy. The first one was the guy, the really good looking guy who's training the young Clydesdale, and then he ships it off to Budweiser, and he goes to see the Budweiser Clydesdales, and the horse remembers him, and it comes running back. And then the next year, they introduce the puppy. There's the woman who has the puppy mill across, which maybe has a negative connotation in our current PETA-influenced society. But she's got this little puppy mill, and this puppy keeps coming over the horses, and then she sells the puppy. And of course, the horses kidnap the puppy from the guy who buys the puppy and brings it back. And then the next year, the puppy gets lost. So there's these 3, and that's obviously very creative. And a lot of people love those ads. They were set to iconic songs that went with those ads, and were really, 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 really wonderful. So it's obviously important. And those ads, I think, created a lot of feelings of warmth and fondness to Budweiser. But at the same time that they were creating all this warmth and fondness for the horses and the puppy and, maybe Budweiser in general, what was happening to Bud Light sales? They were decreasing. Why is that?
Bud Light sales, not Budweiser.
Bud Light sales and Budweiser actually was decreasing as well. Why is that? Because your little hipster generation thinks that Budweiser is a horrible, and the opinion is, and I actually read a history of beer because that's what I do as an academic. I read really interesting things that would make most people fall asleep because I'm interested in sort of one topic. And one of the reasons I became interested in this was because there's this argument among your generation that at one point in time in this country, we had good beer, pure beer that was locally brewed and had full body and all of this stuff. And the honest to God truth is, most beer before Budweiser and before the big beverage companies took over was crap. And it was near poison, and it may kill you in many instances. And I would submit to you that for those of you who like all this crappy microbrewery beer, perhaps you should be. I went over to the Bricktown Brewery the other day to meet my colleagues. There's a group of us that meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays after class and have cocktails and complain about both the administration and our students, just to let you know. You're welcome to come over sometime and join and listen to me, complain. I don't bitch about anybody in this room. I love you all. Tell yourself
Where's that
over and
real
over
thing
and
where
over
we go? Extra credit?
No, it's not for extra.
That's
Anyway,
so you don't like a solid IPA?
Wait, if we buy you.
no, IPAs are horrible. They're just god awful.
What?
Budweiser actually set standards, and they brew, and so you've got you have a product that has reasonable consistency. They've got one over there that has blueberries in it. That's not beer. That's I don't know what the hell that is, but it's not, it's some hipster junk that we should all be absolutely horrified by. But
Do you hate craft beer?
Oh,
I hate
Budweiser's
craft beer.
actually really
yes, I do. I absolutely hate it. I love Budweiser. I love Bud Light.
What's that under your-
I mean, it is God-given American beer until the commies called InBev from the Netherlands bought it, which
Do you
just
like
annoys
Coors
me.
Light?
No, Coors Light is just awful.
What about PBR? I know you have PBR.
It's okay. It's okay. I'll drink PBR. Yeah. Not Coors Light now. No Coors Light. Anyways, we're getting far afield here.
What's
But,
that?
sorry.
the point of this is that the point of this is it's just like I do like Starbucks and I don't like Chick-fil-A. Both tools of the devil, in my opinion.
Chick-fil-A is the Lord's
It's the Lord's
waffle.
chicken.
Waffle.
It's
You
just
2 days in a
god
row,
awful.
both times those were
Yeah,
wrong.
I mean, I hate both of those companies. I hope they go broke. But I have strong opinions on lots of things.
Honestly, I think if I videoed you saying that, I'd put it on Twitter or something.
You'd be
What?
like
You would-
attacked.
Yeah, you would be getting attacked. People would.
It's on YouTube.
I also.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
It's being
What's your
broadcast
average
live.
What's your average viewers on YouTube?
It depends. As test day comes, more and more people watch the videos.
Do you think this makes
So-
sense?
at this point.
No.
Anyway, those were creative
Absolutely
ads.
not.
He gets detailed about his mother's
Those,
business.
those were creative ads. But Budweiser, because your generation is insisting that they want to have more flavorful beer, which is not beer if it has blueberries in it, it's just not, it's something else. Is been going down. So they actually fired their ad agency and they've gone with somebody else. Production of TV commercials can exceed $1 million, and of course, buying those slots, particularly if you buy it during the Super Bowl, like Budweiser does, is an enormous expenditure outlay. So what is a creative ad? What makes an ad creative? What are the elements of creativity? Well, or what makes a creative ad better? They're more memorable. We all remember the Budweiser commercials and God-given beer. They have a longer lasting impression. As a result, you can often use less media spending if you create those favorable impressions. It can build a community of fans, a fan base. And the opposite is true, which is poorly conceived can equal a huge liability for the company. If an ad is poorly conceived, and there have been lots of ad campaigns that have backfired on companies because they didn't understand what was going to be created in the mind of the consumer when they did something, and it has a negative connotation. And I would submit to you that what can happen is that what starts out as maybe being acceptable, particularly in the field of like trademarking, may become unacceptable. What's happened with, for example, sports teams. Lots of sports teams have changed their name. And we've talked a little bit about this. The Redskins are receiving a lot of heat from Native American groups who say that they should change their trademark. At the time they came up with that trademark, it didn't have the negative connotations that it does now, but it does. But does creativity necessarily increase sales or the revival of a declining brand? No. So good ads can do these things, poor ads can be a liability, but having a really good creative ad does not necessarily mean that you're going to have an increase in sales or that a brand that's in decline can be brought back from dead. At some point in time, I would think that Coca-Cola in the United States, now it may be a long time, when we talk about the product life cycle of things like Coca-Cola, it's an enormously long life cycle. But at some point, I think people are going to stop drinking as much Coke, just as they realize that it's not healthy for you. Coca-Cola, by the way, and I love Coca-Cola. It is God-given, American, red-blooded, unlike Pepsi, which is communist tool of the devil. Right? If you like Pepsi, you're just wrong. I'm sorry. So you've got good, red-blooded, honest American Coca-Cola. But having said that, what is Coca-Cola a wonderful product to do? Well, you can clean your battery cables with it. It just takes away the corrosion on those battery cables like you wouldn't believe. And if it's going to take away the corrosion on those battery cables, what do you think it's doing to your inside? And it's probably not good.
Don't they use it to clean blood off the highways?
I don't know if they use it to clean blood, but you can use it to clean your battery.
Oh, if you put a
So,
screw in there, 3 days later your screw will be gone.
not that quickly, but yes, it will become corroded. And so at some point, I think Coca-Cola.
I want to stop.
Yeah, I still drink it though.
You like?
So I like Coke. I don't want to stop.
I like Coke as well. Well, I like Diet Coke, but I like it as well. It's just not great for you. And at some point, as creative as Coca-Cola is with their advertising, it's one of the reasons that they're diversifying their brand portfolio, and they've started doing all these other things, sports drinks, waters, and teas and other things, because that is declining in terms of consumption in the United States, although it's going up in other parts of the world. So what is creativity? There are different perspectives on what creativity is. It's a spectrum. Creativity is a little bit like the Supreme Court case that dealt with pornography, and Justice Potter Stewart said he couldn't define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it. So what is creativity? It's one of those things that we can spot it, we can say that's really creative, but can we define it? Well, there are different perspectives, and there's a spectrum, I think, of creativity. Your text talks about this. At one end, people will say that creativity equals sales. But I don't know that that's necessarily true. Because lots of ads may create and generate sales and not be at all creative. When I was a young child, I can remember the first cases of what they called at the time GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. They didn't call it AIDS, and they didn't know that it was caused by the HIV virus at that point in time. They've come out with drugs now. How long, and I've asked this before, how long has Patrick Johnson been living with HIV? He does not have AIDS, right? AIDS is a determination that the disease has progressed to a certain point that you are symptomatic of what the virus is doing to your body. And lots of people now, because of the really good drugs that are out there, are not even, if they go in for a blood test, they're testing what? They tested positive at one point in time, they have the HIV virus, but if they do an antibody test, what will they test? And it's become a whole thing in the dating world. People will put on their profiles, that they're positive but undetectable. That's possible now. That wasn't possible 15 years ago.
People
The
do
drugs, what?
that. People do that.
You put on their profiles?
Um,
Well, they should make a platform for just HIV.
I would not be surprised if you couldn't find an app
Like a group.
just for
right?
that. But,
But I was really
you could have a really crappy ad campaign at this, when the first cocktails came out for HIV, they could have, just making people aware of the possibility that this is not a death sentence. It didn't have to be terribly creative, and it would have increased sales a lot, because people didn't know, and all of a sudden they have this knowledge now of something that may save their lives, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those ads or those marketing campaigns that they did were terribly creative. You can use a production model with something like that. If you let people know and you build it, they will come, they'll take it. Because the alternative, which is death, is, not attractive. But there are people who argue that creativity should equal sales, and that's all that determines creativity. On the other end of the spectrum are the liberal arts types, the hippie dippies. If you cross the parking lot over there, they're going to say there's got to be artistic or aesthetic value. And your perspective oftentimes depends on your role in it. Are you the company that's buying an ad and needs a return on investment because your sales are lagging? Or are you the creative director of the ad agency who looks at it from, this is a piece of art? Well, how do we determine creativity? Your text says that the determinants of creativity are the ability to generate fresh, unique, and appropriate ideas. What makes something creative? Divergence. Not the film. How many of you have seen the film series? Do you like it? Divergent?
Yeah.
What is it in the film? Why are they called divergents? Or were they called insurgents?
No, they were
divergent.
They were divergents. Okay. Why are they called divergent?
because they were different than the two classes of people, right?
There were more than two classes of
They're
people,
four.
but they contain elements of all
Yeah.
of them. And so they're divergent, they diverge. The elements are novel, different, and unusual. There's an element of originality, something that's surprising or rare. What made the herding cats commercial divergent? Well, we generally don't think about cowboys and the American West as being guys that rescue cats from the water. You know, you think about big, tough cattle, herding cattle, right, with cowboys. So there's this novel, and it's surprising, it's original. It was surprising. Creativity, your text says, also has flexibility. You change from one perspective to another. It elaborates on the unexpected details, but there is a synthesis or a nexus, a connection between those ideas. That it has some artistic value. Think about the elements of a really creative ad. What is it about the Budweiser ads with the horses that is artistic? What makes it artistic? Well, it's things like the setting. Where's the setting for the 3 ads that I described?
At their barn.
It's at this beautiful farm for the Clydesdales that has the perfect, it's what we think of as the idyllic horse farm fencing, that great white, 3-row, that's called Kentucky style, by the way, fencing. It's now made out of, some kind of, it's no longer wood. In the olden days, it was wood rails, 3-rail wooden fences. Now it's made out of plastic. If you've got really expensive stuff, it can be made out of Kevlar.
Yeah, there's like a rubber.
That's almost indestructible. The barn is the ideal image of a barn. It's that sort of Dutch style barn, with the pitched roof and the big doors. There's artistic in, the setting. It's got beautiful trees. You've got the perfect actor playing the guy who's raising the Clydesdales. He's got the perfect, you can picture them getting together, and and they do at the end with the puppy commercial, the really good looking guy and the puppy mill lady who is, very pretty and attractive, are sitting there discussing the Clydesdales and the puppies over a beer on the fence, right? That's all sort of artistic. Relevance, the degree to which the ad is meaningful and useful to the consumer. The creative challenge. How do you do this? Well, it's based on research. And you start with the research on the company, understanding the product, the consumer, developing creative briefs and strategy statements, and from that coming up with objectives, taking risks. Ad agencies generally argue that clients need to take risks, but they often don't. Clients don't like risks. Why is that? Well, if you're going to spend millions of dollars on an ad campaign, taking a risk may mean that what? If you're a publicly traded company, you have to go back and explain to the shareholders why it is that your ad campaign is failing miserably. So there's this tension between the creative and the hard selling ads. So your text talks about the suits versus the poets, and this natural tension that exists in planning and creating a strategy. So creative personnel that will come up with the concept. The perceptions are, and if you look at the sort of Mad Men, what are the creative types? And one of the things that I hate about the Mad Men is they use a stereotype. Anybody watch Mad Men? Nobody watches Mad Men. What's one of the, actually there's several in the creative types. They have sort of a stereotypical gay guy in the creative department. Actually, they have two in several of the seasons. And we have a tendency to think of the creative types as being freewheeling, free-thinking, eccentric, flamboyant. But your text says that IMC requires creativity from everybody, including the company. I used to date a girl who was a hairdresser, and her biggest complaint was people would come in and they'd say, I really want a new look. Don't cut too much off. Well, these are sort of mutually exclusive categories, right? You either want a new look or don't take too much off. So your text tells you it requires creativity from everybody, including the company. Buy in that. So what is the creative process? Young says that the creative process is similar to an assembly line. Now, one of the criticisms of this is that if you think about it in this way, again, if you think about it in a linear perspective, yeah, you can have sort of a linear narrative, but a lot of creative people would say it's not. I don't go through this, and it's difficult to discern where one stage begins and the next ends. It's a holistic approach, and so you have to, when you think about these things, yeah, you can think about it as sort of 5 elements or 5 steps, but it's oftentimes difficult. It's like the sales process and the sales cycle. We tend to, again, think in terms of linear steps in the sales cycle, but it's a holistic process. Some sales are going to be really easy. It's going to be like shooting fish. You're not going to have to go through all of the steps, right? And you should always be closing. You should always have this closing frame of mind. But what are the 5 steps according to Young? Well, immersion, information gathering. Immerse yourself in the problem. So your client comes to you. Our sales are lagging in the Saturn line. How are we going to do that? What are we going to do? Well, immerse yourself in gathering information on the Saturn line. What was it that was attractive about the Saturn line? Well, one of the things that was attractive about it was that they had a different, I think they were one of the first American cars to have sort of the longer than standard warranty, as I recall. Different, sort of process in selling it. So gather information, immerse yourself in the problem, then work over the information. And then your text tells you, or Young says, that then you have to let it incubate. What is this? Letting it go out of the conscious mind. And how do you do this? Well, lots of people work on multiple projects. If you think about artists, a lot of artists will have multiple canvases. I like to paint oil, and so I have like multiple things that I'm working on. And I'll look at a painting and I'll think about it for a while, and then I'll come back to it, maybe a month later. So letting the subconscious take over. And then getting that sort of inspiration, the illumination, which she calls the birth of the idea. And then having your reality check. Does the idea still seem to solve the problem that you're facing? Graham Wallace, who's a sociologist, says that it's also linear. He's got a step process that's similar there. He says preparation, gathering your information, incubation, letting the ideas develop, illumination, seeing the light, and then refining and polishing the idea. So conducting research, how do you do that in this process of being creative? Read everything related to the product. If you really want to be successful, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to really understand the product. Our salespeople at the American Education Corporation had to go over and talk to our developers. We required it as part of the sales team that they would go over. They had to understand not only how, they had to have obviously the sophistication to understand all of the code, but how it was developed and what the back end was like. Talking to all of those parts, productions and operations, and the people involved. Listening to what people are saying, customers, clients, even other agency staff. Use the product. Go to the client's business and learn about the client's business. Conduct qualitative research. What is qualitative research? What kind of research can we have? Focus groups. What do you do with a focus group? How do you conduct a focus group? What do you do? How do you conduct focus groups?
Yeah, I think it's 8 to 12 people.
Yeah, you have a group of people that come in,
And
and
you have the moderator.
moderator who, maybe gives them the product,
Keeps them on track.
talks about it, sees what they say, records it, monitors it. Ethnographic. So the advantage of a focus group is you can get more perspectives than You could, just from doing maybe a survey, which could be absolutely quantitative, right? How much do you like this on a scale, on a Likert scale, from like it very much, somewhat like it, neutral, dislike it, extremely dislike it. Focus groups allow you to get more in-depth knowledge. If you really want to do really in-depth, you go into consumer ethnography, and this is rooted in anthropology, and you so actually go out and look at how people are using things, watching them in their sort of native environment, and how they use products. One of the things that's interesting to me, I was on a plane coming back from when I was getting my PhD at New Mexico State. I was on this plane, and I was coming back, and this guy had a new iPad, and I'm like, oh, how do you like the new iPad? He's like, it's great. It was designed for business. And I'm like thinking, no. He was a veterinarian, and he was a professor. The reason he was on the plane with me is he had done a presentation at New Mexico State, because New Mexico State's the ag college, but he was a professor at OSU. And he's like, it's designed for business people. And I'm like, no, it's really not. If you think about the iPad, lots of businesses were buying it. They were using it for business, but is the iPad really designed for business? I mean, was it designed for business? Is that what Steve Jobs had in mind when he came up with the iPad? Lots of businesses are using it. What's the problem with it as a business tool? I mean, this is unexpected. People were using it in business. My sister, that was one, when they first came out, her company bought everybody iPads. But what's the problem with it? It's a great business tool. It's actually, I mean, it's like the iPhone. The iPhone has become one of the biggest sellers, and people in business love their iPhones. And it's really not a great platform for business. What was a much better platform for business people? Yeah, the Crackberry.
I love my BlackBerry.
I loved it too. It was great because you had a full key, and you could type. I could text like remarkably quickly on that, because you could feel the keys, and you knew if you're good at typing, it was actually a much better platform. But looking at how people are actually using it, people actually do use their iPads in business, and they use their iPhones in business. It's not necessarily the best one. So ethnographic research, looking at how they actually use it in their natural environment. Then verification, revision, storyboarding your ideas. Then developing the campaign. Most ads are a series of messages that comprise the IMC campaign. Making sure there's consistency among those elements of the campaign. So if you're doing more than just television and radio, that it actually goes and you have this consistent message throughout. Creating that central campaign message through your theme. You develop a creative brief, which gives you the basic elements. And sometimes this is called the work plan or the creative blueprint. Premised on your major selling ideas. The big idea that's going to make the consumer stop and listen. And then finding a dramatic way to convey the unique selling proposition. The positioning, creating in the mind of the consumer the position that you want. Now, again, once you do this, once you create that connection, that mental connection in the mind of the consumer, it can be very difficult if you find out that that's maybe not the position you want to be in, to undo it. So really you have to think about these things. Where is it that Bud Light really wants to be? Do you think? In the mind of the consumer. And did the horse ads actually convey that?
Since they fired their actors, all of them.
Who drinks a whole lot of beer?
College students.
College students, your generation. Are they creating that mind, that position? What is Bud Light seen as among your generation?
Dilly dilly.
Dilly. I think a lot of your generation see it as, if that's what your dad drinks. isn't it?
See, I see Coors Light is what my dad drinks. Now,
Tastes like skunk weed.
My dad drinks Shiner Bock or Amazon.
It can be really difficult to reposition. Who's trying to do this? So like forever and ever, what was Buick's position in the market, if you think about this?
Most people.
They were a sort of solidly upper middle class, professional, older car. Why? They're boring.
aren't they trying
What-
to go
what was-
electric now?
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
They're trying to
They
do-
kinda
They're
changed their
trying to
strategy a
change
little
their strat. They're trying to reposition themselves to not being your grandmother or your grandfather or your dad's Buick, to being a more hip, relevant brand. Is that working for them? They're trying it. How successful are they being in repositioning that brand? Any of you running out to buy a Buick? What's the mental image you still get in your mind? When I said Buick, you said what? Old people.
My sister-in-law bought one, it's just, it just looks like an old person car, like, it's,
Yeah, it's still kind of expensive, like, I don't know, if you're trying to market to a younger generation that doesn't have the money to buy it, right?
I prefer a Lincoln, mainly
Well,
because
if you're gonna
of
buy
their
a luxury
engine
car,
base.
I don't think they're not luxury cars,
Yeah.
but a higher end
I
car,
agree with you.
you're not gonna buy.
I've been driving a Lincoln since before it was cool to drive a Lincoln.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that that works either. 'Cause
Yeah,
he's
that's
just-
an old person car.
he's just so, I mean, I'm using, after his whole meltdown, at the Golden Globe Awards and then at the Academy Awards, when you're, aren't I great? I mean, his entire speech was how wonderful he is and how he's become the pinnacle of acting,
I don't think
leading
I've- I
male
don't think I've
role.
seen that.
Oh, God, it was
I need
just,
to
it
see
was,
this.
it was the creepiest. Matthew McConaughey, it was the creepiest acceptance speech I've ever seen in my entire life. You should Google it. And then they've got him doing the Lincoln, and then the whole him falling into the water thing. That was just stupid.
Or he
I
goes
must have missed out on a lot since.
Yeah, he goes like 30 miles an hour in reverse.
Yeah,
It's just
it,
chills.
yeah, it's just, I don't know what they're thinking there.
Not bad.
But repositioning. Any questions? Well, we're getting caught up, yay. And we're actually, I'm gonna let you go early. So if you feel cheated, you let me know and I'll keep you late on Tuesday. We'll cover another chapter, start in on another chapter.
I thought the ones with commercials were great.
Which one?
See, I've always liked them, like they.
I was just like, what?
Put together pretty well.
Did everyone else have a call?
I don't know.